Welcome to my home studio, or rather to my parents' back garden in Dublin in Ireland. As I mentioned to a few of you, my father got ill at the end of last year, so I needed to get over to see him. But it shouldn't prevent us from moving forward with our discussion about human population impacts on the environment. In particular, what I want to introduce you to is the idea that the human life history strategy is something that is both evolved and one of its characteristics as an evolved strategy is that it's enormously flexible, and that flexibility is what has allowed it to increase very rapidly over the last certainly couple hundred years. So the two big questions that we're asking in this section of the course is first of all, why did a rare species such as ourselves, a rare tropical primate, become so populous, especially considering the fact that rarity itself is often an evolved strategy and not just an accident, but something that is determined by very real kind of biological characteristics of the species. But on the other hand, there is enormous flexibility in the human life history strategy that has allowed it to explode when the conditions arise. The second question, which we'll defer until next week, is the question of how many people ultimately can the Earth support. At almost 7.5 billion is the planet essentially overpopulated. Just a reminder of some of the global population statistics that we looked at a day or so ago. A reminder that the numbers of people on Earth, this is drawn from the US Census Bureau data, that those numbers are very high indeed, 7.4 billion people. But the growth rate, the rate at which we're adding to that population, the growth rate itself is relatively small, so historically low at just a little over 1% per annum. But that 1% that's acting on an extremely large number means that there's 77 million new people net on Earth every year. And that would mean, for instance, 13 or so new Irelands being added to the world population every year. The median fertility projection for the middle of the century is about 9.4 billion, and although there was some hope that maybe the population would stabilize by the end of this century, the stabilization probably won't occur until sometime early in the next century. Perhaps it's an easier way to think about the both the growth rate, but also the implications of the lowering of growth rate worldwide, is to think about it in terms of the number of births per woman globally. So currently that stands about 2.5 births per woman, which contrasts with about 5 in the 1950s. So this decrease has been very substantial, and it's been almost global, that there is a fertility drop in most parts of the Earth, although the diminution has clearly been greater in some parts than in others, and remains high, for instance, in sub-Saharan Africa. The other two big demographic, that is population stories that we discussed already, and just to summarize, is the impact that the HIV/AIDS pandemic had on world populations. It certainly has had very dramatic impacts on life expectancy in Africa. The other big story, of course, is with the increase in longevity, both males and females, that there's been a pronounced aging of the world population. More and more people are making it into their 90s and even making the century. That has a lot of implications socially and economically. Today's lesson, though, is to allow us to reflect upon how we became so populous. And to do that, we're spending some time thinking about this notion of life history strategies in the first place. So to introduce the idea, a life history strategy is a evolved suite of characteristics associated with a given species that determines how long it lives, what age it matures, how many offspring it has, and so on. So if you compare a fly, for instance, with an elephant, we know that these are very distinctly different types of organism when it comes to understanding how long they live, the number of offspring, and the like. And those differences then translate into pronounced divergences in the way in which those species can avail of resources when they become available. It means that one group of species may have explosive population growth, and other species may remain relatively rare but in equilibrium with their environment. Really, when we're talking about life history strategies, we're really thinking about the way in which an organism is confronted with the facts of both birth and death. This is something that I call the existential equation, but rightfully it's can be referred to as the basic population model. And I could ask you, I'm not going to give you the time now unless you want to pause this video for a moment or two. Just think a little bit about, what are the basic factors relating to human biology that you'd need to know in order to predict how populations change. And it may be that you would list several of them, but ultimately if you whittle these down to two factors, ultimately it's births and deaths. What is the rate at which new organisms are born, and what is the rates of death? So in circumstances where birth rates are extremely high and death rates relatively low, we know that PC, the population change, is going to be enormous. These considerations about kind of the lives, the births and deaths of organisms are really at the very core of our understanding of evolutionary change. Darwin, drawing upon the Reverend Malthus, who we'll talk about in a later class, kind of recognized that this capacity for striking population growth, what he calls geometric growth, we might call it exponential growth, which is in common to all organisms. So all organisms have the capacity in the right circumstances to grow in their population very rapidly. This leads, Darwin contends, and this is right at the core of the origin of species, his account of evolutionary change through natural selection. The high growth and the potential for high growth amongst all organisms is what drives the struggle for existence, or competition between organisms, because there then is inevitably a struggle for access to resources, and competition ensues, and that competitive exchange between organisms is the process that drives evolutionary change. And what Darwin wants to note is that even in a relatively slow breeding animal like elephants, if that growth is unchecked, if those elephants have access to unlimited resources and don't have are not preyed upon, those populations can grow ultimately to be very rapidly. But what he is contending is that elephants are very slow breeders, and that slow breeding is a feature rather than a bug in their system. So they're not like flies, they grow very, very slowly, but in the right circumstances those numbers can get very big. By the way, I'll give you a moment, you can pause it to read the Darwinian quote here, but he takes pains to make a calculation about how long it would take for a single pair of elephants to produce millions of descendants. In fact, you could extend this calculation and speculate about how long it would take the Earth to be wall-to-wall elephants, even at a slow growth rate, would happen inevitably. It may entertain you to know that despite Darwin's great efforts with this calculation, he got the calculation wrong. He did get the principle correct, of course. So really what we're saying here is that life history strategies, those biological characteristics that determine the schedules of births and deaths, are adaptive. They've been evolved. And the body of theory that inspects the trade-offs involved. Under what circumstances is an organism going to produce large numbers of young, large litters, for instance? Under what circumstances are the parents of organisms going to invest a lot in parental care, as is the case in elephants and humans? These are all kind of trade-offs that determine the life history of organisms, and this is what we call life history theory. So each species has its own relatively unique life history strategy. So if you've done ecology already, you know that the two kind of best known of these life history strategies are referred to as R strategy and K strategy. So again, I would ask that you pause the video for a moment and look at the slide or the image to the right, and recognize that our strategies are generally associated with very high rates of increase. You know, those organisms that live in a precarious equilibrium with the environment. For instance, if you can imagine a forest where every time there's a heavy rainfall and there's pooling of water, that there are inevitably those organisms that are able to take advantage of that temporary pool. Maybe, paramecia, protozoan organisms, bacterial, fungal species that can grow extremely rapidly. Now, they can only grow very rapidly because that's their life history strategy. And then contrast them with elephants and humans, where those organisms are in relatively stable equilibrium with the environment and have relatively slow rates of increase. Now, what's maybe not immediately intuitive is that there are both morphological, related to the shape and size of the body, as well as physiological implications associated with the adoption of both of those strategies. So unsurprisingly, those organisms that can take very rapid advantage of resource availability, that live in very capricious disruptive environments, tend to be those organisms that have small bodies, relatively short lives, short gestations, very large litters, and so on. Whereas the K strategists are quite the opposite. These are organisms that have large bodies, longer gestation, long periods of parental care, and the like. So the results of all of this, if you look right to the end of that graphic to the right with the two population graphs, it's looking at the way in which population changes over time. Very typically for our strategists, those populations can bounce around quite a bit, taking advantage of resources as they become available, whereas in the K strategists, the populations tend to be relatively slow growing or else are kind of relatively stable with over time. So you could do this then is, because there is this relationship between life history strategy and what an animal or a plant looks like, you can think of any animal. And if you have patience with this little ditty, it can be big, it can be small, it can live in the sea, it can live on a wall. Actually, I don't know many organisms that live exclusively on walls. But if you were to think of any animal, and then there should be, it should be possible to predict what age that animal lives to, for instance. Why is that? It is because there is a hitching of the morphology of the animal with the with its size and with other aspects of its life history. So you could graph all of these. This is a relatively recent paper that showed that there is a predictable relationship between the body mass of an animal, how big it is, and its longevity. So unsurprisingly, on the bottom left, a forest shrew, small little animal, it doesn't live very long. An African elephant is very massive, very large, and it has a relatively long life style. There's some other very curious exceptions to the rule here. For instance, flying animals often live longer than you might predict from their body mass. The explanation for this, you might want to pause and think about it a moment or two yourself, but the explanation for this, of course, is that they manipulate the existential equation, right? They live longer because flying is an enormously useful anti-predator strategy. But generally speaking, there are these important relationships. Here is looking at similar relationship. It is looking at the length of an organism on the y-axis against the generation time. Generation time is essentially the amount of time it takes between organism being born and its maturity and its contribution to future generations. And again, what you can see here, if you look to the top right of the graphic, is that humans, or man as they have here is also governed by some of these laws. So had humans been substantially bigger, it would mean that it would have been a manifestation of a slightly altered life history strategy. So we're pretty much exactly where one might predict on this graph, being a relatively tall organism, or a massive organism. We have a perfectly predictable generation time, perfectly predictable longevity. Now, I use this sort of notion of R and K strategies as a way of illustrating some of the understanding that ecologists have of the relationship between morphological, physiological characteristics and their reproductive capacity. These days, ecologists are not satisfied that R and K strategies are to be seen really as kind of isolated strategies into which you can dump large numbers of organisms. Rather, it's easy to kind of think of them as a spectrum, or better still, just to think about life history strategies as being arrayed along a continuum of fast and slow cycles. So, just to read here, on the fast, slow continuum view of things, some species, quite independently of whether they're in a population at carrying capacity, like archaea organisms, tend to reproduce early, have large litters, short gestation time, etc., etc. So there are some organisms that are going to defy the simple dichotomy between R and K. So it is complicated a little bit. So we've been talking about life history strategies in general. I want to turn in the last moment or two just to be thinking specifically about humans and going back to our questions of how we became so populous. So the graphic here from Joel Cohen's book, How Many People Can the Earth Support, illustrates, actually it kind of illustrates how difficult it is to illustrate how aggressively the human population grew. So he's looking back a million years here, so it would be going back into the hominin line, early into the history of the genus to which we belong, recognizing that for most of that period of time humans were astonishingly rare, these rare tropical primates, and it's only really in a explosive way over the last couple of hundred years, but maybe over the last 10,000 years since the invention of agriculture, that human population growth has started in earnest. So like any other organism, humans have a strategy for survival and reproduction which translates into the potential growth rate. What is interesting about the life history strategy of humans in particular is, not that it's evolved, but that it's both extreme and, unsurprisingly, it's flexible. Unsurprisingly, because this is what we've been learning about the biology of humans since the beginning of the quarter with Tattersall, is that humans tend to be extreme but also very flexible or plastic. So it's extreme in the sense that humans have very low infant mortality rates. Humans depend upon the parents for long periods of time. Our brains mature slowly, our behavior matures slowly, and we're also kind of long-lived, but that in a way that might be easy to predict. So this plasticity, this flexibility that we have allows us to reproduce at for long periods of time, long periods of cultural time, with relatively small families versus sometimes very large family size that precipitates large percentage growths over time. I'm going to end here with this. I think it's important and edifying model that invites us to think about the range of human fertility, that allows us then to think about those circumstances under which growth becomes explosive. So there's two things to keep an eye on. One is the frequency of births for humans, which is flexible, and also the amount of time that humans are kind of exposed to the possibility of pregnancy. And by humans, of course, I mean women. In the circumstances, demographers tend to have almost no interest in men, because from the perspective of birth, we have a modest role to play. So think about this. It's kind of pretty obvious after we've gone through it, but at the same time it's compelling because it gives us an insight into the range of family size that might pertain in particular circumstances. So if you wanted to calculate, model the frequency of human births, you would have to take into account the typical periods of infertility and the flexibility of that period for women. It can range from 3 to 24 months. That is, the amount of time between the birth of a child and the onset of ovulation again after that birth. And of course that's critically dependent upon the amount of time that a woman nurses her child. So in circumstances where nursing prevails and goes on for relatively large periods of time that is that's a long period of time. The suppression of ovulation is relatively long. You would also take into account, if you're trying to determine the frequency of births, the length of time that pregnancy occurs. Pretty obviously, the good news here maybe is that if you're pregnant, you can't get pregnant. So that 9 months or so of pregnancy reduces the frequency of births. And then, of course, tragically, in many circumstances, fetal mortality on average, kind of for calculations of this, will kind of reduce the frequency of birth. So the amount of time that a woman is kind of exposed to the probability of pregnancy is what the demographers call the fecund period. It kind of depends upon the age of mating. Demographers are often conservative. You will see this written down as the age of marriage, but the age at which a woman goes into a union that may produce offspring, and culturally in different circumstances it can range from 15 to over 25 and to over 25. So if that then initiates the period that can where pregnancy can start, depending upon whether it's early or late marriages, that is going to have consequences for the size of the family. The end of the fecund period, usually lower than 50, of course, is extended these days in some circumstances through kind of technological interventions, but anywhere between 38 and 50 or so. Okay, so this is where the model then gets interesting, because if you have a relatively short fecund period, getting married late, menopause occurring early, it means that maybe there's only a 15-year period or so. And if during that 15-year period the births are spaced apart, you will end up, or a woman would end up having about 4 children. There are other circumstances where those fecund period is very long, the intervals are very short, where one could conceivably, pardon the pun, have over 16 kids. So you can then kind of start to speculate about the circumstances under which it is typical in human kind of cultural communities where anything from 1 kid to 16 kid is the norm. And this is a calculation that comes from Massimo Bacchi in his Concise History of the World Population. So, under what circumstances will humans have on average 1 kid all the way up to 16? We've already seen that 4 would be kind of the lower threshold. So anything below 4, we can speculate is going to require some sort of contraception effort. The good news is, that the theoretical maximum of 16 is, can occur in the case of twinning. There's only very, very rare individual cases where this is the case. But there are other circumstances, and Becky gives some examples here of, for instance, periods where there's very early unions, very early marriages, very minimal intervals. He gives the population example here of French Canadians born between 1660, where the typical family size was 11. In those sort of circumstances, you can get kind of an explosion of growth, and very typically, this occurs during periods of colonizing. So, you'll find that a lot of the early American populations are the, both in the US and Canada, population growth is very high. But then if you go to the very lower end of the scale, where the typical family size is 3 or even 1, looking at the example of 1, the population example that Becky gives here is in Italy, where there's voluntary birth control, very high diffusion, meaning most people are adopting birth control. Population can sink to 1. So, as a result of all of this, our conclusion is that life history strategy, looks at the evolutionary significance of these varying aspects of an organism's life history. Although all organisms can have this high geometrical increase, the exponential growth. Some species are common, some species are rare, and both of those are just different ways of surviving. So there are evolved strategies that are adopted by different organisms. Humans, and this is an extension of what we've been reading in Tattersall, have an evolved life history strategy that is fairly predictable for the sort of organism that we are. We have the characteristics of our life history strategy, the small family size, long periods of parental care, and the like, is characterized by great flexibility. And that flexibility, as we've seen with the Becky model, allows for extremely rapid increases in population growth rate over certain periods of time, and helps us understand why, in the right circumstances, the human population really took off and we became this globally populous species. But it also kind of reminds us that this flexibility, particularly with the diffusion of contraception, means that we can, in the right circumstances, also reduce our population growth rates to the point where we may see a stabilization of the population in the next century, and maybe even a decrease in world population sometime in the coming century.